All right, folks, I am going to begin. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to class after your first big challenge of the course, the first midterm. Congratulations on getting through that. Congratulations on getting through, ideally, all your other midterms at this point and being at this point in the semester, which is a nice point to be at, but it's definitely not a point to be relaxing in. So just keep that in mind. It's not a time to kind of rejoice about the fact that you've gotten over a hump, because several humps await you, and you want to be able to surmount those humps successfully. You want to walk away from the entire semester feeling good about what you did here, rather than walking away feeling good about some of what you did. So keep your head in the game. It is a game that we all play here. There are rules, and the more you put into it, the more endurance you have, the more you can get out of it. So the point is to win ultimately, and you win by doing well in the classes that you've taken on. So take them on, like don't run away from them. Don't turn away from the challenge, like face it head on, and things will work out for you. As far as the exam goes, it's a mixed bag as far as like the overall performance of the course, but that's a pretty standard pattern for these courses. No matter where this course is given, no matter what school it's at, you're always going to see like a curve. You're always going to see like a broad sort of range of scores. And you're always going to have a fairly low, relatively low mean to what you might in like a normal classes. These classes tend to be a little bit more challenging because there's just a large volume of information that you're expected to learn that you aren't familiar with, is not necessarily intuitive. And so once again, doing well in this class is a function of how much time you put into it and how much you're keeping up with the material, how much you're learning as we move along, because things tend to compound. And if you're trying to cram a bunch of learning into the last couple of days or even the final day before the exam, it's just a recipe for disaster. And I think this class is kind of like a boot camp for folks that are kind of like just getting into college and kind of trying to feel out the whole process of like how do you do this successfully. A class like this is sort of a wake-up call to like the kind of challenge that college really is about. And the challenges don't get smaller as you go forward, they get bigger. So as you advance to 200, 300, 400 level classes, and maybe even above to graduate level, the challenge becomes bigger and bigger. And so you need to adapt to the requirements of what you need to do well now, and then kind of build upon that for the future. And so hopefully those of you that didn't do so well in the exam are going to adapt to the circumstances that you're facing, this class, how it's structured, the things you're expected to learn, what you're expected to put into it in order to do well, and ideally you will do well moving forward. There's plenty of opportunity for that. So if you didn't do so well in the exam, things can change for you and things can turn around. So just work really hard right now and don't be discouraged. For those of you that kind of landed in the middle, that's a decent place to land. It's a place where you're basically you're putting in just like the bare minimum to kind of make it, and that's not terrible, but that's not reality. Like in reality, if you want something good out of the world, you have to always be striving to be at the top. You always have to be striving to be the best at what you're doing. And not for other people, not for me, not for your parents, not for your friends, but you have to do it for yourself. Because if you do it for yourself, then you'll always have that incentive to like always be aiming to be the best person you can be. And then you cultivate that kind of drive inside of you, which you then carry forward into the future, which then allows you to thrive in the world beyond the walls of college. So just getting by ain't gonna do it out there. And so if you are just getting by here, you still need to adapt, you still need to change, you still need to grow and become the better person that you are able to be. To those of you that wound up at the top of the curve, congratulations, great job. I have taken my hat off to you. It's challenging to wind up at the top of a curve, especially if you wind up at the top of a curve with actual scores that represent A's and B's. So if you wound up like with actual scores out of 100 that are like 80 and above, like that's exceptionally well. That demonstrates to me that you could go anywhere and excel, not just at CSUN, maybe even top tier schools where you're competing against a lot more competitive people that are all sort of ready to like be the best all the time, and it's super challenging, but you would thrive in that environment. So good for you. Keep doing what you're doing. It's gonna pay off. And for those of you that aren't there, I want to be very clear about the fact that I know that you can be there. You can become that person. You can be better. And there's nothing stopping you but yourself. And if you believe that you can't, then that is your first obstacle to becoming what you can be. So you got to change your mentality. You got to get out of old mindsets. You got to get out thoughts that you have that might be based on things that people have told you, experiences with other professors or teachers growing up, things that you've heard in the media that maybe have clouded your ability to simply hone and be precise about who you are. Like you need to kind of work inside of here to kind of get out the person that is in there that can be at the top of a curve, walk away with straight A's from a semester, get several degrees if you want, go out there and find the best job you want and get it and move forward. So work hard and become that person, and things will work out. I promise you. Question. Well, I mean, in reality, like we always going to have things like that we're dealing with, like maybe personal things, maybe you have a job as well, and you're trying to balance school with work. Um, it's about prioritizing in your mind. Like you want to be able to just make this the most important thing in your life, and this is what you do, and then everything else kind of like supports that, right? It's kind of like around it. But you also do have to make sure that you are enjoying your life. Like when you do have moments to enjoy yourself, take them. Like really enjoy them. Really like be in that moment. Be with your friends. Be by yourself. Whatever it is that you do to enjoy yourself, do that, because there has to be a balance. You can't. Nobody's a robot. We're not robots. Like you have to be able to kind of like take your mind off of these things that are heavy, that are big, that are that carry a lot of weight and responsibility. You have to be able to take a break from that. But again, like it is about like prioritizing in your mind, like this is who I am, this is what I do. I am a student in college. That is my job in the world now. And then everything else kind of falls around it. And it doesn't mean that you will have no time. It just means that like most of your time you will spend trying to figure out how to make it all work. So just try to make it all work. And, like kind of always kind of being ahead as well, like kind of knowing what's coming and like kind of seeing the time that you have like weeks ahead, like kind of plotting it all out either informally in your mind or actually writing down like what's going to happen, dates, and like, how much time you might have to kind of just make sure that you don't wind up in like, a cramming session for something important, so things like that. Hopefully that helped. All right, so this is sort of like the ranges that resulted from the curve. So the curve is basically intended to target a mean, so like an average for the class. So the actual average for the class was 61.4, so I targeted like I think a 70. And so by targeting a 70, I get like a number of points that the exam will be out of for everybody, that will then get me to that mean for the entire course. And then I use that, and then I take your score out of that, and then I get a percentage, and I multiply by the 25 percentage points that the exam winds up impacting your grade with, and that gets me to the Moodle score that you saw on Moodle. And this is the most important score that you should be worried about, because those are the points that add to your overall grade that then will be compiled in the end, and then what I'll do is I'll curve the entire class based on those points. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind what I say down here, that the actual grades that you see here are not actual grades. They're just kind of an indication of where you lie. So if you're like a couple of points off from like a certain bracket, that's nothing to be upset about. That's nothing to even dwell on. because it's meaningless at this point. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that you wound up relative to everybody else in this group versus this other one that I sort of arbitrarily created. Um, but in the end, this is the structure of like how the final distribution of the course will be. And thus, there will be people at the top, there will be people at the middle, and there will be people at the bottom. You don't want to be at the bottom, so you can't let this class slide. If things aren't going well now, it's time to like double your efforts. It's time to really push to get closer to the top. And you can turn it around, like I said, it's possible. All right, I think I pretty much covered everything I want to talk about with this. I'll be passing back exams at the end of the lecture. Are there any questions about anything? Yeah. Yeah, people have asked me that before, and that's like the one thing I'm not willing to do because I truly believe that people should be always taking notes in class. And but the problem is that like people will print them out and then they'll basically just use them as like a crutch and they'll maybe write a couple of things in here and there, but like they won't necessarily be taking notes like the way you should be. And that's my only thing. So there might be people that are less inclined to do that, but overall I feel that it would be a problem, and so I don't do that. That's the one thing I don't do. But I provide everything afterwards, and I do encourage people to watch the lectures again and retake notes or maybe fill in your existing notes. That's something you should be doing, and therefore you could do that post a lecture. You could print out the slides and then take notes on the lecture again, watching it. That's something you could do, but I don't post the lecture slides before. Yeah.
So there's the grade, there's the range or the grade, the actual grade. My grade doesn't go with the percentage.
If there's a percent, you mean a percentage number? I said don't worry about any other number besides the actual number out of 25. Okay. Other questions? All right, folks. Like, it's really worth it for you to work really hard. It really is worth your time and effort because in the long run, it can get you things in this world, things that you maybe even think are not achievable. Everything that I've ever accomplished has been due to what I have done. It has nothing to do with my family or privilege of any sort. Like, I come from a very poor family of immigrants. Like, I had nothing, and I got myself through school, and now I have a lot of value inside of me that people want to use. They want to utilize. I'm choosing to be here, but I can go out into the world and have all sorts of opportunities. I just choose to be here because I enjoy teaching and I want to be a researcher, and that's what I set out to do. But like, just based on the hard work that I put in throughout my life, like I am valued in the world. So like for my dissertation, like I needed data on the film industry because I decided I'm going to merge my fields in my dissertation so that I could then come back here if I wanted to, if I didn't want to teach, and go work in some studio at some like executive level. And so I looked for data, and the company that collects the data for the industry, they charge $25,000 per month for access to the data, which obviously I couldn't afford. And so I tried to talk to them, and there was no assistance there. So then I looked up more information on the company, and I found out that one of the investors was Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban is like this billionaire who owns like the Dallas Mavericks. So I was like, screw it, I'm going to try to contact this guy. So I actually found his email address somehow online. I don't know how you find the email of a billionaire online, but it was there. There were a few emails. And so I sent him an email, and like when you're talking to people that important that have so much money, like their time is very valuable. So you have to be like as precise as possible. So it was like a 1 or 2 sentence email, like, this is who I am, this is what I've accomplished, this is what I'm looking for. I need data. Can you help me? I know you're an investor. And like he responded to me within the hour. Like this billionaire guy who's like super important, who's like famous and has so many people looking to have him help them and trying to get his interest. he emailed me within an hour, and then the next morning I was talking to the CEO of the company that that collects the data, and then they gave me the data. Like it was like that. Like it was very quick, and it was all because like this is who I am, this is what I've accomplished, and he immediately saw that, oh, you're worth my time. I'm a billionaire, but you are worth my time. And the only reason I was worth his time was because I worked my butt off for years. And now people like him are willing to pay attention to me. They're willing to give me opportunities. They're willing to help me. And that's it. There's no difference between you and I at all. All it takes to get to that point in this world is to work your butt off. That's it. Just like work, 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 work. There's something that you feel you can't achieve, work hard to achieve it. There's something you feel you're not getting, work harder to get it. That's it. Like it takes all of your time, then you know what? It takes all of your time. But in the end, there are results to that, and you see it. Like it's possible. So just work really hard, folks. It is worth your time. You can make something of this life in this world. And again, it is just a function of how much you put into it, always. So just work really hard from this point forward. And again, it's not about a grade in this class. It's not about your grades in your other classes. Like that's not what it's about. It's about like developing that person inside of you that is always looking to create that value inside of yourself that, you know, can then be very valuable in the world that we live in. That can get you through the doors that you feel are closed to you now. Those doors will open for you, and things can happen. So just keep that in mind. And again, for those of you that didn't do too well, don't be discouraged. Like this is an opportunity to turn things around. It's an opportunity to kind of, again, adapt and grow and change and become better. So take that and move forward. And that's what we'll do together. We'll move forward today to the new chapter that will begin the second part of the course. Unless there's any questions before I get moving about anything at all. All right, cool. So we are now going to turn to chapter 10, which is on savings, investment spending, and the financial system. So we figured out in the last chapter, chapter 9, that some of the determinants for economic growth are all sort of based on our ability to increase labor productivity. Labor productivity is what allows us to have the kind of economic growth that allows us to, over time, develop into the sort of country that we are today. It's what provides opportunities for countries like China and India to have the upward mobility that they've been having. And we identified 3 factors in that chapter that are responsible for economic growth. And one of them is the amount of investment that a country makes in its capital. So capital being like the machines and the tools that we create in order to produce. And in order to do that, we have to save. So savings lead to the ability to invest in capital, which then allows us to grow. And so that's what this chapter is about. This chapter is about how do we align our savings and investment? What are the connections between savings and investment? How are they aligned in the economy? And then ultimately, like, what is the financial system that we operate in? What are the various characteristics of it? What are the various types of assets that investment can take a form of? So that's basically what this chapter is about. We just focus on this very specific savings and investment relationship that is so crucial to economic growth. So we'll first talk about matching up savings and investment spending. Then we'll talk about the financial system itself. Basically just talking about, what are the big players, what are the assets, and then finally we'll talk about financial fluctuations. We'll talk about sort of the ups and downs of the economy in relation to the financial system. So that's what we've got in store today, and then finally I'll pass out exams, and then we'll be done. Of course, there'll be a break at some point in the middle. So, alrighty, so let's get going. So what we're going to learn in this chapter, that we'll learn the relationship between savings and investment spending. We'll look at aspects of what's called the loanable funds market. which is sort of like this hypothetical market in which all savings are being supplied and all investment is being demanded, and it gets us to an equilibrium price, which is going to be an interest rate for the economy. And so the demand and supply model will come into play in this chapter. We'll look at the purpose of the 5 principal types of financial assets, which are stocks, bonds, loans, real estate, and bank deposits. We'll look at how financial intermediaries help investors achieve diversification. So financial intermediaries are essentially like banks or institutions like bank that channel savings into investment. We'll talk about some competing views of what determine asset prices and why asset market fluctuations can be a source of macroeconomic instability. So the link between like the greater ups and downs in the economy and sort of these markets for assets, we explore them, but that's a big theme in macroeconomics in general. We're often trying to sort of like predict what assets are going to do and sort of understand the links between like the ups and downs of the business cycle with the prices of these assets, because as we all know, like the stock market is a huge part of the world that we live in, and the way those markets fluctuate has a lot to do with the way the overall both domestic and international macroeconomy fluctuates. So I will briefly touch upon some issues here, but we'll get more into this stuff as the semester moves forward. All right, so let's focus specifically on matching up savings and investment spending. So we'll first talk about the linkages, and then we'll talk about the sort of this hypothetical market that allows us to then kind of get us to like an equilibrium for this sort of backwards and like push and pull that exists between people that are looking to invest and people that are looking to save. All right, so one of the essential ingredients to economic growth, as we said, is an increase in physical capital, mainly created through private investment spending. So in the modern economy, individuals and firms that create physical capital often do it with other people's money, money that they borrow or raise by selling stock. So to understand how investment spending is financed, we first look at how savings and investment spending are related in the economy as a whole. Then we'll examine how savings are allocated amongst investment spending projects. All right, so let's talk about the relationship between savings and investment spending. We're going to look at 2 cases, one in which there is a closed economy, in which there are no linkages to the outside world, so the economy is just itself an economy rather than connected to other economies from maybe other countries that then creates like an international flow of funds and goods. And we'll do it through what's called the savings and investment spending identity. So savings and investment spending are always equal for the economy as a whole, is what the savings and investment spending identity tells us. It's a fact of accounting. So we just assume that if we track all of the investment spending in an economy, that it can be matched up to exactly the amount of savings that exists in the economy at the time. So remember that GDP is equal to total spending on domestically produced final goods and services. And therefore, we can write the following equation. GDP is equal to C, which is, again, consumption spending. We have I, which is investment spending. We have G, which is government spending. And then we have X, which represents all the spending on exports. So all the goods that we are selling overseas, we're getting money for that from foreigners. And then we subtract the amount that we spend on imports, the goods that we're buying from abroad. And together, that gets us to our gross domestic product. All right, so that's sort of going to be the base of the starting point for understanding this equivalence between savings and investment more precisely. So in a closed economy, so that's the first case that we'll consider, the closed economy, in which there are no exports or imports. In that situation, we have X equal to 0 and imports equal to 0. So there's no money coming in from exports and there's no money being spent on imports. So therefore, in a closed economy, GDP is just equal to C plus I plus G. So recalling that the overall income of this simplified economy would, by definition, equal total spending, then again, we can equate the total value of all goods and services produced to the amount of spending that occurs in the economy by the three major players, which are consumers, the government, and firms that are spending money on investments. So again, total income is equal to total spending in this case. All right, so we've established these two relationships. So income can either be spent on consumption or government purchases or saved. So that's just sort of a general property of income. It's either going to be spent on goods and services or that income is going to be saved. So therefore, we can also say that GDP is equal to consumption by consumers on goods, consumption by the government on goods, and some leftover amount of savings. So total income is equal to consumption spending by the government and consumers and savings. So we've got total spending from equation 1 equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending. And so that's one relationship that we can set up this equivalency for, which tells us that, again, total income is equal to total consumption plus investment spending. So if we equate this relationship, equation 2, with this relationship, equation 3, so basically we set our incomes equal to each other, and we just subtract consumption and government spending from both sides. So we just subtract C plus G from both sides. We wind up with just the equivalency of our savings and investment. So savings and investment can be tracked in a closed economy in which no imports and no exports exist to being exactly equivalent. So savings equals investment spending in that scenario. All right, so we can go further, still considering the closed economy case, and break down our savings into different types of savings. So savings can come from the government if it's spending less than it collects in taxes. So we have what's called a budget surplus, which is the difference between tax revenue and government spending when tax revenue exceeds government spending. So when the government's collecting more taxes than it's spending, they've got a budget surplus. It's always sort of a big target for the government. They're always looking to have a budget surplus. It's always a big sort of issue when during election cycles in particular. I haven't really heard the candidates talk too much about it recently, but there's always mention of the fact that, like, in the 90s we had a budget surplus because of Clinton's policies. So, and then we haven't had one since. We've had deficits ever since, and so that is always sort of a big selling point for the Democrats. Budget surplus, again, being the situation where we are collecting more than we are spending, but there's an opposite case, and that is the case where we are spending more than we are collecting, and in that case we have what's called a budget deficit. So again, the difference between tax revenue and government spending when government spending exceeds tax revenue. And in those cases, we often say that the government is dissaving, that they are not saving, they're actually losing savings. We call it dissaving. All right, so the budget balance is the difference between tax revenue and government spending. So it's the actual number that exists, whether it be positive or negative, is what then determines if we have a budget surplus or a budget deficit. But the actual number is just the budget balance. So it can be defined as government savings, which equals the amount of taxes. So T equals the value of tax revenue, minus G, the amount of government spending, minus TR, which are the transfer payments. So transfer payments are payments made by the government to households like welfare or Social Security or unemployment, things that are just like money given back to homes from the government. So the difference between what the government collects, what it spends on goods and services, and the transfers it gives back to households is the savings for the government, which is the budget balance. And if it's positive, then we have a budget surplus, and if it's negative, we have a budget deficit. So the savings are what we call national savings, the overall savings of a country. So it's the sum of private savings and the budget balance, and it's the total amount of savings generated within the economy. So when we set investment equal to savings, we were actually setting it equal to national savings, which, if broken down, again, equal the savings from households, but also the savings from the government, if there are any. So if there's a budget surplus, there will be savings. And if there's a deficit, we'll have dis-savings, but the budget balance will be a negative number in that case. So national savings equals government savings plus private savings. Now, private savings is what's called disposable income, income after taxes minus consumption. So households, make a certain amount of money, and obviously part of that is taxed away, so part of that goes back to the government, and then what's left over, households either use it for consumption, buying goods and services, or they put it in a bank and save it. So that's what the savings are. It's disposable income net of consumption, minus consumption. All right, so we've got our national savings that can be broken down into government savings and private savings. And we know that savings equals investment spending in a closed economy. That, again, is the case that we're considering. So equations 5 and 6 tell us that in a closed economy, the savings investment spending identity has the following form. National savings equals investment spending. All right, now let's open up the economy to trade once again, a more realistic case, and see what happens to this identity. Ultimately, we will still have this equivalency between savings and investment spending, but the savings will not just be like national savings. So any given country can receive inflows of funds, foreign savings that finance investment spending in that country. This is something that we established early on when we looked at the circular flow diagram. We saw that firms from abroad are able to invest domestically, and so they're able to put their savings into our financial system, which then we are able to use to finance investment spending. Any given country can also generate what's called outflows of funds, domestic savings that finance investment spending in another country. So that brings us to this next concept of what's called net capital inflow. So net capital inflow is the total inflow of funds into a country minus the total outflow of funds out of a country. Net capital inflow. So in recent years, the U.S. has experienced a consistent positive net capital inflow from foreigners. All right, so $1 of investment spending financed by capital inflows comes at a higher national cost than $1 of investment spending financed by national savings. The extra cost is that the interest must eventually be paid to foreigners. So that money doesn't stay within the national system. That money is sort of leaks out of it. We have to pay money back that we borrow to invest, but whenever you borrow money, there's a certain amount you have to pay back on top of the principal, the amount you borrow, which is the interest. And if you borrow that money from abroad, you got to pay the interest abroad. So a country that spends more on imports than it earns from exports must borrow the difference from borrowers. So like we usually do in this country, we run what's called a trade deficit, meaning that we are buying more goods from abroad than we are selling. then that extra money that we need to buy the goods from abroad that we're not getting from the goods that we're selling, that needs to be financed. That needs to be borrowed. So that difference, the amount of funds borrowed from foreigners, is the country's net capital inflow. So the net capital inflow is also equal to the difference between our imports and our exports. So the reason why the U.S. has had a positive net capital inflow in the last few years is because we are buying more goods from abroad than we are selling. And so there are then extra, then we have to borrow money from abroad, and that money comes from this difference between what we buy and what we sell. So foreigners are selling us goods, and then they have this excess funds, this excess amount of funds to lend us from the excess amount of imports that they are selling us. So remember, this is an aggregate. This is like in total. So you can't think about like one individual exporter and one individual importer here. You have to think about the entire system of trade and our trade with all the countries and the sort of the net capital inflows that result from all of that trade. In the end, we are, with the rest of the world, buying more than we are selling. And so foreigners are then getting more money from us. And so then that money is channeled back to us that we can then borrow to invest. So we have positive net capital inflows because we have a trade deficit. All right, so if we rearrange our GDP equation to solve for investment, so going back to our GDP equation in the open economy, in which GDP equals consumption plus investment spending plus government spending plus our spending on exports minus the amount we pay for imports. If we solve this for I, meaning that we subtract C plus G plus X minus IM from both sides, then we wind up with investment being equal to GDP minus C minus G plus imports minus exports. This is just an intermediate step. We're going to get to the final result pretty soon. All right, so from equation 1, we know that GDP is equal, so total spending is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending. So in a closed economy, we know that domestically, all of our spending is equal to the amount we consume, the amount we invest, and the amount that governments spend. So we also know that GDP minus C minus G equals I. So GDP minus consumption spending minus government spending equals investment spending, which we also have established to equal national savings. All right, so we've got this identity here, which basically tells us what net capital inflows are. And we've got this identity here, which tells us what investment spending is. And we have this identity here, which tells us that GDP minus C minus G is equal to national savings. And we know that this part is equal to net capital inflows. Therefore, in an open economy, if we plug in equation 9 and 7 into 8, it tells us that investment spending is equal to national savings plus net capital inflow. So that's the big difference between a closed economy and an open economy. In a closed economy, national savings is equal to investment spending. And in an open economy, investment spending is equal to national savings plus net capital inflows. So not just our national savings, but also like the foreign savings, the excess amount of money we get from the goods, we give to the foreigners for their goods, net of what we spend on their goods that they now have to sort of just save and invest. So their savings are available to us on top of our national savings, which equals our private savings and our government savings. So we have private household savings plus government savings plus savings from abroad, which are the net capital inflows. And thus, in an open economy, investment spending is equal to savings as well. And savings can be broken down into these components in an open economy. A lot of terminology there, a lot of things to think about, but it does ultimately make sense if you follow the flow. And if you didn't follow the flow, go through it again, you'll get it. It's not hard to get. It's just you kind of have to think about all the players and what what their roles are in getting this equivalency. So again, this means that investment spending in an open economy is equal to savings, where savings is equal to national savings plus net capital inflow. In the United States in 2013, investment spending totaled $3.2 trillion. And private savings at the time equaled $3.4 billion. This was offset by a government deficit, so the budget balance was negative. So we had negative $368 billion there that sort of brought down our savings. And you see that kind of brings it short of the amount of investment spending. But then, of course, it was supplemented by net capital inflows of $423 billion. So because data collection is imperfect, there's going to be a statistical discrepancy, in this case of $212 billion. So it didn't exactly equate because accounting practices are imperfect when you're trying to track all the flows of all the money in the entire economy. But in reality, they do equilibrate. They do become equivalent. So there is an error in the data, not in the theory, though, because the savings investment spending identity must hold in reality. All right, so here's just a couple of examples, like a snapshot of like the U.S. compared to Germany with respect to its investment spending and what we can equilibrate it to. So in this case, we've got investment spending in the United States. This is for 2013, and over here we've got capital inflow. So here's the savings from abroad. Here's private savings, and then we've got that budget deficit there. And over here in Germany, the picture is slightly different. We've got this amount of investment spending. We've got this amount of private savings. And instead of them needing to finance like a budget deficit, they wind up having excess savings. They have a very small budget deficit, but they do have an excess amount of savings, which then is capital outflow, which for them is money that they invest abroad in other countries, which may have partly financed our budget deficit. So some countries are savers, some countries are spenders, some countries even have what are called sovereign wealth funds, which are like savings accounts that they have that then they use as like investment vehicles. So like they'll act like almost like a hedge fund that kind of like diversifies risk, which is like to spread out risk in a variety of assets. So it just depends on the countries. The countries that usually are able to do that are rich in resources. So like the countries that have like a lot of oil, they tend to have like these big savings accounts, sovereign wealth funds. And other countries that have like big commodity sort of reserves, commodities being like generic goods that are sort of like the basic building blocks of other goods. So like steel and like copper and things of that sort. Oil also falls into that. All right, so that is how we can link investments and savings, and that is sort of like the breakdown of both sides of that identity. So now let's talk about how savings are allocated to those that want to borrow the funds. Like how are these savings channeled to those that are going to be most efficient in the use of those savings in their investment projects. And we do that by using the supply and demand model. So we have what's called the market for loanable funds, the loanable funds market. So savers and borrowers are matched up with one another in much the same way that producers and consumers are matched up through markets governed by supply and demand. Although there are a large number of different financial markets in the financial system, such as the bond market and the stock market, economists often work with a simplified model, which they assume that there is just one market. So we really just simplified all. This is a hypothetical market. It's not a real market. It's just a way to sort of understand the relationship between the demand for loanable funds and the supply for loanable funds, and how that actually winds up setting a very important price in the economy, which is the interest rate. So the loanable funds market is a hypothetical market that illustrates the market outcome of demand for funds generated by borrowers and the supply of funds provided by lenders. The price that is determined in the loanable funds market is the interest rate, and we denote it just by the letter R. R is the interest rate. R is the nominal interest rate. So the nominal interest rate is the interest rate unadjusted for inflation. In the last chapter, we looked at the real interest rate. The real interest rate being the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So again, this is when we're talking, the interest rate we're talking about here is the nominal. It's not adjusted for inflation. Although there are all sorts of loans and interest rates, we'll assume that there's only one for the sake of analysis. All right, so let's first talk about the demand side of the market for loanable funds. So savers and borrowers are matched up with one another in much the same way producers and consumers are matched up through markets governed by supply and demand. So we get this downward sloping relationship between the price of the loanable funds, which is the interest rate. So there's a price to borrow funds, and that's the interest rate, right? Like you have to pay that price in the long run. As you pay back your money, you have to pay interest on it. If you're taking out student loans, there's an interest rate that is going to be accruing over time, which is the price you're paying for being able to go to school ultimately. So we've got the price for loanable funds on the y-axis, like the price of any market, it's always going to be on the y-axis. And then we have the quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis. In this case, it's measured in billions of dollars. And there's a negative relationship. As the interest rate is higher, the amount of loanable funds demanded is lower. And as the interest rate goes down, meaning the price of borrowing goes down, the amount of loanable funds demanded is increased. So the sort of the more precise rationale for the downward sloping demand for loanable funds can be understood by understanding what's called the present value of investments. The present value of X, some investment amount X, is the amount of money needed today in order to receive X at a future date given the interest rate. So let's go through an example so that you understand exactly what that means. So suppose that exactly 1 year from today, you're going to graduate and you want to reward yourself by taking a trip that's going to cost you $1,000. So in a year from now, you're going to graduate, you're going to spend $1,000. In order to have $1,000 a year from now, you won't need that much today because of the interest rate, right? You would invest some money today that would have a return for a year that will get you to that $1,000. So let's let the amount that you need today be X, and we'll let R be the interest rate that you receive on bank deposits. So if you deposit X and earn an interest rate R on it after 1 year, the bank will then pay you your amount times 1 plus the interest rate, right? So if you multiply your amount times 1 plus the interest rate, you'll get your amount plus your amount times the interest rate, which is the return you get on the amount you invested. If the amount they'll pay you in a year is $1,000, then the amount you need today can be figured out by setting X times 1 plus R, so the amount you invest today times 1 plus the interest rate. You set that equal to 1,000, you can solve for X just doing a little bit of algebra, and that'll tell you how much you need today to invest in order to have $1,000 in a year from now. So if we divide both sides here by 1 plus R, 1 plus the interest rate, which again is just a number, so you're just like dividing both sides by a number, which is pretty standard algebraic manipulation. Then the amount you need today, X, is equal to $1,000 divided by 1 plus the interest rate. So notice here that the value of X depends on the interest rate, which is always greater than 0. So there's definitely a relationship between X and R here. So let's say the interest rate is 5%. So if we plug in 5%, then we have 1,000 divided by 1 plus 0.05, which is equal to 1.05, which winds up giving us the amount you need today to invest to be $952.38. That's at 5%. Let's say the interest rate was 10%. So again, if you plug in R equals 0.1 in this case for the interest rate, then the amount you need to invest today is equal to $909.09. So what we see here is that if we increase the interest rate, then the amount we need to invest today decreases. So there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and the amount that you need to invest today. So as the interest rate goes up, the amount you need to invest today to have $1,000 in the future goes down, and vice versa. As the interest rate goes down from 10 to 5%, then the amount you need to invest today goes up from 909 to 952. So there's a negative relationship between these variables, X and R. So in this case, X is always going to be less than 1,000, and the larger that R is, the smaller what is now revealed to be X, which is the present value of $1,000. So this means that there is a negative relationship between the present value of an investment and the interest rate. So X is the present value of $1,000. In this case, the present value of $1,000 at an interest rate of 5% is $952.38. The present value of $1,000 at 10% of return per year is $909.09. Gesundheit. All right, so let's say a firm like we call companies that produce things firms in this class and economics in general. So let's say that a firm has two potential investment projects that will yield $1,000 a year from now, and that each has separate costs they have to incur in their investment projects. So let's say one costs $900 and the other costs $950. So if one costs $900 and the other costs $950, the project worth borrowing money for will depend on the interest rate. So if the interest rate is 10%, then the present value of $1,000, so again, if you invest in this project, you're going to get $1,000 a year from now. If the interest rate is 10%, the present value of $1,000 is $909.09. So that's what your investment is going to be worth. That's the present value of your investment. So then you compare that to your costs to figure out, is it worth doing? Is it worth taking on? So we see here that at an interest rate of 10%, the present value is only going to make one of the projects worth it, because the first project has a cost of $900, so there is a balance there, which is profit, right? The difference between your costs and your revenue being $1,000 in present value today. And then at a 10% interest rate, the present value of $1,000 is not going to be enough to cover your cost of the second project, which is $950, and therefore it will not be worth taking on that second project. If the interest rate was 5%, though, then the present value of $1,000 a year from now is $952.38. In that case, you've got a present value of your $1,000 investment that exceeds both the cost of both projects, and therefore it's worth it to take both of them on, because you will make a profit on both projects. And so the interest rate has a lot to do with the demand for savings, which is the demand for loanable funds. And we see that there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and the demand for loanable funds that are used for investing. So a firm will borrow more and engage in more investment spending when the interest rate is lower, and vice versa. So a lower interest rate will lead to higher investment spending in the economy as a whole. The demand curve for loanable funds therefore slopes downward. So this relationship between the interest rate and the present value has basically everything to do with the negative relationship that we see here between the interest rate and the demand for loanable funds. As the interest rate goes down, the present value of a project increases, and therefore people want to borrow more because they get bigger returns on their investments. So the intuition behind present value calculations is simple and also explains the negative relationship. So the interest rate can also be thought of as like the opportunity cost of investment spending. Instead of spending money on an investment project, a company could simply put the money into the bank and earn interest on it. So the higher the opportunity cost of investment spending, the lower the number of investment spending projects firms will want to carry out. So if the opportunity cost of investment is really high, then they're not going to want to invest. They're just going to want to get that standard return. So that's another one of the sort of underlying relationships that explains this negative relationship between the interest rate and the demand for loanable funds. Now let's turn to the other side of the market, the supply for loanable funds. The supply of loans is going to be upward sloping due to the opportunity cost of lending. So savers could use their money to go on a vacation rather than lend it out. By saving money today and earning interest on it, savers are rewarded with higher consumption in the future when a loan is repaid with interest. So the higher the interest rate, the higher the opportunity cost of them just spending their money on fun, so the higher the interest rate, the more they'll get to spend their money in the future on more fun. And so the higher the interest rate, the more folks are going to be willing to save. So like at 4%, people are willing to lend out $150 billion, meaning they save that money, which is then lent out via the financial intermediaries, which we'll talk about after the break. And at 12%, obviously, the opportunity cost goes up for people, and they are then willing to put their money into banks, get that bigger return, and wait for the future to spend that money on whatever they were interested in spending it on. So as a result, our hypothetical supply curve of loanable funds slopes upward. So when we're talking about like the markets and macroeconomics, like you can't simply establish like there's a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve, because we're talking about such big forces that are being combined into like a very simple framework. And so you have to explain why when we're going to simplify a very complicated part of the world into something so simple, why we can do that. And that's what this was all about. It was all explaining why we can sort of use this hypothetical market to understand movements of the interest rate. All right, so now if we throw in our supply and our demand together, then of course we're going to get to an equilibrium for the market, which will be the equilibrium interest rate. So again, it's going to happen at the intersection of our supply and demand. So here is our R star, our equilibrium interest rate. And in this hypothetical example, the equilibrium quantity of loans that are made are worth $300 billion. So the equilibrium interest rate is the interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds supplied equals the quantity of loanable funds demanded. So under this situation, we've got that 8% interest rate, and all the projects at 8% and above are projects that are profitable at an interest rate of 8% or higher and funded. So, there's folks that maybe have projects that the interest rate won't cut, like the way the present value of their investment goes, like the interest rate won't cover their costs, and therefore they don't wind up borrowing the money. But for all these folks, it's worth it to them. In fact, for all of these up here, it's more than worth it to them. And this person right here, the 8% exactly equilibrates the present value of the investment to the cost of the investment, whatever that might be. So over here, we've got, on the supply side, we've got offers accepted from lenders willing to lend at an interest rate of 8% or less. So at an interest rate of 8% or less, you're going to get all of these lenders willing to supply funds to these folks that want to borrow. And for these, it's worth it to them up and beyond their own costs. So generally, we assume that the prices that sellers set are set at their own marginal costs to supply. And so for all these banks over here, it costs them a lot less than what they're charging to supply these loans, and therefore they're getting what's called a consumer surplus, an excess above what it costs them to supply the good. So let's say this bank over here, it costs them this much to supply, maybe like 3% or something, and they get 8%. So the difference between 8 and 3% is 5%. So they have a 5% producer surplus as a result of being able to take part in this market where the price is being set above what they are willing to borrow at. Over here, we're going to have projects with a rate of return less than 8%, and those are not funded. So those are the projects that, again, the 8% will not get them a present value that will exceed their costs, and therefore they will not borrow at this equilibrium. And then over here, offers are not accepted from lenders who demand interest rates of more than 8%. So these are banks that need more than 8% to make the loans viable for them, profitable, and so they wind up not being part of this market because of this equilibrium interest rate that's below what they're willing to accept. So in equilibrium, the quantity of funds that savers want to lend is equal to the quantity of funds that firms want to borrow. Loanable funds lead to an efficient use of savings. So this interaction between the supply of funds and the demand of funds leads to an allocation of savings to those that will use it most efficiently, that will actually benefit from it. All right, let's talk about shifts of the demand for loanable funds first, and then we'll talk about shifts of the supply of loanable funds, and we'll take a break in about 10 minutes. All right, so one thing that will shift the demand for loanable funds is changes in perceived business opportunities by those on the demand side of the market, those looking to borrow, those looking to then invest. So a change in beliefs about the payoffs of investment spending can increase or reduce the amount of desired spending at any given interest rate. So during the 1990s, there was a great excitement over the business possibilities created by the internet, which had just begun to be widely used. Businesses rushed to buy computer equipment, put fiber optic cables in the ground, launch websites, and so on. And so at any given interest rate, because there was this whole new dimension of possible investment opportunities, folks were willing to demand more loanable funds. And so that shifted the demand for loanable funds to the right. At any given interest rate, more people were willing to borrow more. All right, another thing that can shift the demand for loanable funds is changes in government borrowing. So remember, governments also spend, right? They also spend to maybe like build roads and airports and provide national defense and all the things that the government does. So a government that runs a budget deficit can be a major source of demand for loanable funds. Changes in the government budget deficit can shift the demand curve for loanable funds. So increasing or persistent government budget deficits are cause for concern because they lead to higher interest rates. So again, if you have a supply and a demand, right, and if the demand shifts to the right, then that's going to bring your price up. And so if the government is an active demander, meaning that they are shifting the demand for funds and raising the interest rate, then that can be a problem for just private investors that have to now face this higher price to invest. Gesundheit. This is what's called crowding out. It occurs when a government budget deficit dries up the interest rate and leads to reduced investment spending. So by raising the interest rate, by increasing the demand for funds, you wind up getting, a lot of those projects that could have been funded at the lower interest rate not being able to be funded because the present value of the investment won't outweigh the cost to some of those investors with a higher interest rate. So crowding out may not occur if the economy is depressed, though. So if the economy is depressed and the government is borrowing, that may actually help the situation, because in that when the economy is depressed, then incomes are down, and therefore there isn't a lot of investment spending going on. And so what happens is, with government borrowing and them spending, then that puts more money into the economy, which then puts more money into people's pockets, which then puts more money in banks, which then allows for investment spending to be galvanized. So government spending can lead to higher incomes, leading to higher savings. Higher savings allows the government to borrow without raising interest rates. So again, that's what happens. You have the demand curve for loanable funds shifting to the right, which then sets a higher interest rate and higher equilibrium interest rate and a higher equilibrium amount of loanable funds. All right, let's do the supply, the shifts of the supply for loanable funds. So one of the shifts is a change in private savings behavior. So again, we've broken down what savings are, and so though understanding those various components can then give us some insights into what might increase or decrease the amount of savings that are being offered on the supply side of the loanable funds market. So a number of factors can cause the level of private savings to change at any given interest rate. Between 2000 and 2006, rising home prices in the United States made many homeowners feel richer, making them willing to spend more and save less. So in that case, we had a situation in which at any given interest rate, folks were saving less. And so then that shifted the supply of loanable funds to the left. It decreased the supply of savings. We also know that in an open economy, which is the kind of economy we exist in, that investment is equal to national savings, which is equal to private savings plus government savings, plus net capital inflows, right? The difference between imports and exports, which is the savings from foreigners. So if there's changes in that, then that's going to shift our supply of loanable funds. So capital inflows into and out of a country can change an investor's perceptions of that country. In the mid-2000s, the United States received large net capital inflows, with much of the money coming from China and the Middle East. So during the 2000s, you had a lot of this sort of like extra money coming in because we were buying a lot of stuff from China, and therefore, there was this trade deficit, and thus there was a lot of excess money that they had, which was then being channeled into savings. So those inflows helped fuel a big increase in residential investment spending, which is newly constructed homes. So this boom of savings, which then shifted the loanable funds supply to the right, which then caused the interest rate to fall, allowed for more investment spending, but it may actually have been one of the sources of the big collapse that we had in 2008, because we wound up with this housing bubble, right, in 2008, which burst in 2008. But it was like this overinflation of prices of homes, which eventually burst. It became very clear that homes were actually not worth that much, and so people stopped buying, and that's when the assets started to shrivel in terms of their value, which then caused the crisis. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about that actually in the next section. So again, that was a situation in which the supply for loanable funds shifted to the right, which then got us to a lower equilibrium interest rate for the loanable funds market. All right, folks, let's take a break. Let's come back at 30. Let's come back at 8:30.